Hi everyone, welcome to part 3. Okay, so now we can look at Blackburn against Nimzovich, played in St. Petersburg in 1926. To explore further the ideas we're looking at the end of the previous section. So e3 is what Blackburn opened with, and then came d6, f4, e5, fe5, d5, knight c3, and bishop d6, which is an offbeat opening for sure, and one that wouldn't be seen at top level nowadays. This move, bishop d6, is interesting. As a general rule, we should develop knights before bishops, but not always. It's essential to consider the pawn structure and which freeing pawn moves are going to be available to our opponent as the game progresses. So e4, now bishop e6, this is to prevent bishop c4. So knight f3 and now f6. Black's strategy will soon become clear. He's aiming to prevent white from playing the liberating push d4, which would give white a central majority. Black's play allows him to paralyze completely white's central majority. So why then does black give white the option of playing that move at this moment? Now Blackburn played d3, and he was correct to do so, but he could have instead played d4. But this would amount to a false liberation that in actual fact merely gives white a weakness to defend after, for example, knight d7 and d5. If anything else, then black is going to play e takes d4 with play against the isolated king's pawn. He can set up a blockade on the e file. So after d5, bishop f7, and black will enjoy the use of the c5 square for his pieces with an easy game and no pressure on his position. So d4 would have been wrong. So d3, now knight e7, bishop e3, and now c5. And having this semi-open d file is very useful for black here, and this move of course creates a strong bind on the d4 square, which in turn will put white on the defensive. So queen d2, sorry, knight bc6, bishop e2, now knight d4. And already black has overtaken the center here. So castles, knight d1, knight ec6, c3. And the strong play of black has now reaped a reward in this weak d3 pawn being created. And also the square, which can be attacked. So knight takes e2 and queen takes e2, and we've seen this position earlier in part 1 where we first looked at mysterious rook moves. So here black plays rook e8, which is the mysterious rook move again, this time from black's point of view, and it's designed to stop the d4 push because then e d4 and the rook is on the e file. This move also, rook e8, also vacates the f8 square so that the bishop can return there, which is desirable as Nimzowitsch saw it. So knight h4, bishop f8, knight f5, and king h8. White's making good use of the f file here, which is his source of play in the position. This move, king h8, is a positional one in the sense that black wants to be able to play g6 and f5. Because the point is that he doesn't have to be concerned with knight h6 check after playing g6. That will become more clear as the game progresses. After g4, he played queen d7, and this is intending, sorry, white is intending g5, and this move is prophylaxis against it. If g5 now, then g6 and f5 can be played, and this defensive idea wouldn't be possible if the king was on g8, because after g6, knight h6 would be check. So yeah, as I said, white is intending g5, and black has won the fight in the center, but he must secure the king side before he creates any active play himself. So next came knight f2, and as I said, if instead g5, then g6, knight g3, f5, and black has a great position here. which obviously he wouldn't have had if he hadn't played king h8, because then knight h6 would be coming with check. So a5, black starts to create some play of his own. He's got pressure on the a2 pawn from the bishop at the moment, and after this move a5, black can play a4 in the event of white playing b3 to blunt the bishop and its pressure on this diagonal. The weakness of the white center has spread over to the queen side already. So a3 and now b5. Another idea is bishop b3, which is strong, but this removes black's defensive response to the g5 push that we saw a moment ago. So for that reason it's undesirable, but it's still playable, and we shouldn't always tie ourselves down to defensive ideas and defensive parries. If we have them set up, we shouldn't restrict our play by, dogmatically sticking to them. So b5, rook a d1, rook a b8, and as Nimzovich points out, the immediate b4 saved a couple of moves later. So rook d2, b4, a b4, a b4. This is the correct recapture, because c takes b4 allows white to break the bind. So d4, and white is happy that he can play this. So a b4, and now it's c4, and this is an ideal position for black, and it's the correct moment to start utilizing the strongest moves possible. I mean, obviously it's always advisable to play the strongest moves possible, but it's important that black does it here. However, by his own admission, Nimzovich didn't play the best moves from here in, and he played rook a8 here, taking the open file, which is understandable, but better was knight d4. Our player might continue bishop d4, cd4, queen f3, g6, knight g3, queen e7, knight d1, bishop h6, and this is the idea of the play. If white exchanges his dark squared bishop to take control of this diagonal, and dark square control is going to be very strong here. So rook g2, bishop g5, and now taking the a file, and it will be very strong. In any case, the point is to play knight d4, encouraging white to exchange off his dark squared bishop and then continue with g6 and bishop h6. And this is a sequence that celebrates the positional advantages that black has built up. If he doesn't trade the bishop, for example, we can look at another line. If knight d4, if then, g6, after c4, for example, so say g6 first, knight g3, now knight d4. If he moves the bishop, the queen d1, now rook a8 and queen a4 can come next, and this is going to lead to a favorable endgame for black. So that's also another nice option. So rook a8, queen f2, now rook a2. It's easy to understand Nimzovich's thinking and what he's doing here. He's following the rules of his system with the occupation of the file and the 7th rank, but again he points out that knight d4 was the strongest move here. So g5, and black's delaying of knight d4 has given white a chance due to a tactical idea. So now his planned defensive parry is not possible, because after g6 comes knight g4, a shocker of a move, and suddenly white is building up initiative, and this move deprives black of all the fruits of his work. So g takes f5, knight takes f6, knight d4, queen f2, queen h5 was also very strong, queen f2, queen c6, knight e8, queen e8, bishop d4, e d4, ef5, and Blackburn went on to win this game, an instructive game in many ways, and the important lessons to take from it are, firstly, how to distinguish between genuine and false freeing moves. Black was able to restrain the d4 push and also the g5 push until he made the single tactical oversight that lost the game. As far as the rules determining a freeing move go, there's no such thing as an absolute freeing move. A so-called freeing move is in an undeveloped position always turns out to be false. The opposite is also true. Moves that would normally be considered freeing moves can very much become exactly that if we are significantly ahead in development. Sorry, moves that wouldn't normally be considered freeing moves. So there's a relationship between how freeing a pawn push is and our development. They're directly related to each other. Okay, so now we can move on to the next section, which involves the clarification of the nucleus of a maneuver designed to restrain a pawn majority, i.e. how to restrain your opponent's pawns when you're faced with a pawn majority from your opponent in a given area of the board. So here black has the f5 and e5 pawns against white's f3 pawn. We'll flip the board here so we can see it from white's point of view. The same principles would apply by and large if he had pawns on a5 and b5 against the lone pawn on a3. Black's main threats are, firstly, to create a passed pawn, and in this instance here, an attack on the white king by playing f4 and then rook f5 to h5 and getting a knight to e3 in some lines. So what should white do when faced with such a threat? Nimzovich's method consisted of neutralizing the extra pawn via the semi-open file that must exist against it, specifically at 2 blockading points, depending on how he elects to advance. If white chooses to play f4 with the rook lift and a later knight e3 in mind, then white can utilize the outpost square e4 with a knight, which will have a huge attacking radius and will be very tough to evict. On the other hand, if black plays for e4, which is another option, the idea of creating the passed pawn, white should answer with f4 and then set up a blockade on e3 with a knight or a bishop. Don't let the fact that the queen can take the pawn here confuse you. Only the principles at work are relevant. What these two options of defense show us is that the nucleus of restraint is an open file combined with a double possibility of blockading. It's essential not to let the central majority advance too far forward, or the creation of a pawn wedge is too terrible to have to deal with, as it creates disarray in our defensive capabilities. Okay, so now we'll look at a clearer version of the restraining ideas that have been mentioned. First of all, we'll look at restraining a mobile center pawn. For example, in the opening, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, d6, and so on, bishop d7. Black can follow up with, after castles, knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, rook e1, castles, bishop g5, rook e8, queen d2, bishop f8. The point here is that he's playing to restrain the advance of the mobile e4 pawn through creating a bind on the e5 square, as we saw before, i.e. controlling it with his pieces so that white is unable to advance it without simply losing it. This is done by the pressure from the rook, which is the reason for bishop f8, and also the pressure from the knight, although that can be traded at any time. If black wanted to take the principle even further, he could place a pawn on s6 instead of a knight, creating an absolute bind, as long as white doesn't play either d4 or f4 in order to play e5. Both of those would be weakening anyway. The subsequent stages of the play for black, if all goes to plan, is to increase the pressure with pieces and thus cause the once mobile pawn to become either backward or isolated, then setting up a blockade with a piece or a bind with piece pressure, and then finally taking the pawn. In short, the mantra is restrain, blockade, destroy. Such a process is difficult to fully achieve, but rewarding when it happens. Nimzowitsch recommended playing several games with such ideas during training in order to get a proper feel for them. So we can have a look at a sample game from Nimzovich in order to clarify further what is being said. Nimzovich had black here against a man called Shoesmith, played at a tournament in Ostend in 1907. So Shoesmith opened with d4, and we saw the following opening moves. It's kind of similar to a King's Indian in some respects, although black hasn't fianchettoed, and white has played bishop d3, which is generally wrong in the King's Indian defense, but not overly so here. So Nimzovich played e takes d4. If he plays instead rook e8 with the same ideas in mind, white can answer d5, and black will remain cramped. For instance, knight c5, bishop e3, knight d3, queen d3, knight d7, b4, a5, a3, and white can play for c5, whereas black standard playing in such positions with f5 is kind of inconsistent with his rook misplaced on e8. So e d4, knight d4, rook e8, b3, knight e5, bishop c2, now a6. The reason for this will become clear in a moment. Bishop b2, bishop d7, h3, bishop f8, f4, knight g6, queen f3, c6, rook a, e1, now b5. And now black's thinking becomes clear. He's played to retain pressure against the e4 pawn and make it difficult for white to advance with e5, whilst at the same time he's playing to break down the white center from the queen side, in particular the c4 pawn, because this is keeping the d6 pawn where it is, which is backward on an open file and therefore weak. If white ever takes, then d5 will become possible for black. So queen d3, now queen c7, defending d6 and further binding the e5 push. So king h1, rook a d8, bishop b1, and now b4, which is an unexpected move because it takes the pressure off white a little. However, Nimzovich of course has a plan, which is to bring his knight to c5 via d7, and then play for a5, a4, attacking the white pawn chain at its base. Playing b4, in addition to increasing the pressure on e4, in addition to that previous thing I mentioned, it also increases the pressure on e4 because it kicks away one of the defenders. And it also transfers black's attack to b3 instead of c4 by taking the pressure off c4 and then following up with a5 and a4, as I said. So play continued. Knight d1, bishop c8, queen f3, knight d7, knight f5, knight c5, and now g4, which is a mistake that means black can change his plans immediately and with decisive effect because of the weakening of the f4 pawn. Excuse me. So now we can play knight e6, attacking f4 again, and after queen g3 you can play bishop b7, and after h4 d5, attacking f4 a third time, and now white crumbles quickly. After e5, c5, cd5, rook d5, king g1 is forced because of the discovered checks on the long diagonal. If instead, for example, if bishop e4 now rook takes d1, is winning a piece. So king g1, now rook d2, this open file is extremely powerful, knight f3 and queen c6, and white resigns. His weakening kingside advance is just completely refuted here. So it's a nice game from Nimzovich and a great exploitation of a positional mistake. Okay, so now let us return to this example, which we saw in the second video, except the knight was on f6 instead of c5. So Nimzovich goes back to this in order to discuss further the struggle against a qualitative majority. If white ever plays knight takes c5, then comes b takes c5, and white is going to and this move is going to paralyze any further progress for white on the queen side. It becomes very hard for him to play b4. However, if he plays instead a3 in order to play b4 next and so on, now comes a4, and if b4, knight b3, and this active knight creates great counterplay for black in return for allowing white to play c5. And the rook pawn is a key player in the restraining maneuver, and this is often the case. Another typical maneuver that Nimzovich used to illustrate the ideas at work cropped up in one of his own games when he had black against Van Villet at a tournament in Ostend in 1907. Van Villet had white and opened with d4, so we'll skip through the opening till we get to the important points. It's quite a kind of offbeat opening anyway. Not a highly theoretical line or anything like that nowadays. We can see what both players are up to though. So f5, and at this moment black is faced with the prospect of queen g3, then h5 and g5, which he can't prevent forever. So he's going to have to organize playing f6 here in order to bind the g5 square, or he's just going to get blown off the board. However, even this is not so nice, because white can play g5 and then take on f6, and after gf6, as happened in the game, white has created a nice weakness to attack as well as huge pressure on the black king. Thus the only logical course of action is to prevent h4 and g5 for long enough to be able to allow the black king to escape. So knight h7, knight f3, queen e7, queen g3, rook f8 just to defend e5, h4 and f6. So it's clear that black is playing to stop this move for as long as possible. Rook a1, he's just taking a moment to defend a3. So queen b7, rook fe1, and now he's just protecting e4, and king f7, rook e2. If instead g5, hg, hg, king e7, and black is just holding on here, but it's a very sharp position. So rook e2, and now rook h8, which as you can probably recall is a mysterious rook move. It's to prevent g5 because of the opening of the h file. So king g2, knight f8, g5, hg, hg, and now knight d7. And in Nimzovich's view here, the attack on the black king has gone wrong, because quite simply white has nothing here. gf6, gf6, and knight h4. He was expecting queen g6 check, and after king e7, queen g7 check, king d6, and black is actually better in this position. Rook a, g8 is threatened, amongst other things. So knight h4, rook a, g8, knight g6. Okay, white has won the g6 square as an outpost, but is that all there is to the position? Rook h5, king f2, knight f8, exploiting this pin. It's actually proven to be a weakness for white. Rook g1, rook g5, and from here Nimzovich went on to win, and he felt that such an escape was so useful that it's worth knowing by heart. We can have a quick look through the final moves just for sake of interest. Nice final move. Okay, so now we can move on to restraining doubled pawn complexes. On top of the dynamic weakness of doubled pawns, there are two further things to consider: the imprisoned bishop, and also lack of space and resultant difficulty in protection. An example of the imprisoned bishop can be found in the following game. And now bishop takes f3, slightly unexpected, by e6, bishop g2. And as we can see here, black has played aggressively and with clear ideas in mind. He's given himself a weakness on e6, but this is easy to defend, and in return he's buried the bishop here on g2, which is a prisoner in its own camp. So play continued, b5, so a4, b4, knight d2, knight a5, queen e2, king f7, rook e1, queen d7, knight c4, knight takes, d takes, and now knight f6. And black, who was one Dr. Erdmann, is calling the shots here. So this is an example of how to vary a piece because of doubled pawns. So for an example of lack of space and resultant difficulties in defense, we can see this one. Here white has not only a huge space advantage, but black's position is virtually immobile and his pieces are tied to defending weaknesses. The queen to defending c6 and the b8 rook to defending against bishop b7 and taking on c6, and the fact that this rook can't move means that the a8 rook is also immobile, and there's no knockout blow here for white, but he can build up at leisure, strengthen his position as much as possible, and then take decisive action. The important thing to note is how the doubled pawns are completely crippling the black position. This is a much clearer example. Here we have a blockading knight on c5, which is hugely effective against doubled pawns. Black's optical majority on the queen side here means absolutely nothing. In fact, every pawn is weak and in danger of being captured. Their weakness means that white can win at ease with his kingside majority. Even if both sides had rooks, for example on a4 for white and b6 for black, the position would still be completely unsalvageable. So this should clearly demonstrate how paralyzing the effect of double pawns can be. Okay, so now we can look at what Nimzowitsch referred to as his own special variation. Before we get to that, it's important to have a look at another line first, which goes, after f4, c5, e4, knight c6, d3, g6, and c4. And this is the key move in the variation that we're looking at here. So I advise you now to pause the video here and consider the positional implications of this move and why white might choose to play it. The reasons aren't obvious at all, and it will take an astute mind to figure it out. So definitely stop the video here and have a think about it. Okay, so Nimzovich's comment on this move goes as follows. Since the move is not played with the idea of preventing the d5 push or making it more difficult, it needs a special explanation. Black is aiming for the setup with e6 and d5 here, and once he has established that, he'll try to extend his attacking formation on the queen side through playing knight d4, encouraging and often forcing knight d4, cd4, and then he's going to have pressure set up already on the c file, or if he has not, then he'll establish it, and the pawn on d4 is going to be very useful in strengthening that pressure. So this move c4 is not to bind the d5 push, as might seem the case optically, but rather it is a preventative measure against this queenside attacking idea of playing knight d4, encouraging a trade, and then creating pressure down the c file. Nimzovich also adds that the d4 hole created by white in this kind of setup appears to be unimportant. So it took a huge amount of moral courage for Nimzovich to state this publicly in his day and age, because it was so against the traditions of the time. But it was his fixation on the blockades that gave him the belief to do so, as he was always looking at the issues it involved in new ways. This also led him to play the move at Dresden in 1926. After e4, c5, he's playing with the black pieces, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, and e5. And this caused a huge sensation at the time. The principles at work are, of course, the same. It's playing to prevent the variation that we saw a moment ago, through creating the queenside play with the pressure on the c file. So now we can move on to Nimzovich's own special variation, which goes c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, and e4, which is another setup along another step, along that same road. And interestingly, another great player, Krause, also investigated the positional implications of this opening completely independently and came to similar conclusions. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this chapter. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with the next chapter as soon as possible. Thanks.